Today's discussion will give you an overview of the laws that apply and protect people with disabilities in homeless shelters and transitional living centers. I am joined today by two experts in this area of the law. To my left is Leah S. Davis, and Leah is an attorney at Disability Rights Texas in the Austin office, and the organization's mission is to help people with disabilities understand and exercise their rights under the law, ensuring their full and equal participation in society. Leah specializes in employment, housing, accessibility, and transportation issues. To my right is Lex Frieden. He is a professor of health informatics and rehabilitation at the University of Texas at Houston. He also directs the Independent Living Research Utilization Program, ILRU, at TIRR Memorial Hermann. ILRU houses the Southwest ADA Center and provides technical assistance on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I am Veronica Carvajal. I'll be moderating today. I'm an attorney at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid in the El Paso office. We provide free legal services to people who are poor in 68 counties in Texas. My areas of expertise for the last 10 years have focused on environmental justice cases, and in the area of housing, on tenants' rights, subsidized housing, private landlord-tenant issues, real estate fraud, and housing discrimination. Today's topic is very relevant because a large number of people who experience homelessness have either physical and or mental disabilities. And all of these are made worse by living on the streets. So it is incumbent upon homeless shelters to provide services to such folks. HUD has told us that over 40% of people who are living on the streets suffer from mental health issues. And while the information today may seem daunting, we hope that you'll remember that people seek emergency housing for a number of reasons. They could be running from an abusive partner. They could be suffering from financial crisis, from extreme weather. And when a shelter is closing its doors on someone because they are disabled, it's not only closing the door on that person and exposing them to danger, but it is also closing the door on an opportunity. Folks who go to the shelters are also often guided towards a better beginning or a new beginning in their life. And they are introduced to agencies and services that they may not have known about were not for the shelter. So we hope that the information we provide today will help you guide folks towards those opportunities. Now, Lex, during your many years as an advocate, I'm sure you've seen a lot of really interesting and also compelling cases. Can you give us an example of someone who was turned away at a shelter because they were disabled?
Well, first of all, Veronica, thank you for helping to facilitate this program. I mean, I think it's very, very important for everybody watching to understand that we're talking about, in Texas alone, 3 million people with different disabilities, people with physical impairments, cognitive impairments, sensory impairments, and a whole range of people that we often don't think of when we think of shelters. We make a lot of assumptions. My own kind of enlightenment, I suppose, occurred in 2001 in Houston when Tropical Storm Allison parked over the city for days and days. And it flooded my home. And I was there with an attendant. I couldn't get out of my wheelchair. The batteries on the wheelchair were sunk underwater. The water came up to the waist in my waist in the wheelchair. I didn't know what I was going to do, how I was going to get out of there. After the water went down, the beds were soaking, the clothes were all soaked, all the stuff that was, it was funny because my wife and I were preparing to do our floors over, and we had taken all the things out of our cabinets and shelves and everything, put them on the floors to move them out so that we could do the floors, and all of our stuff was ruined. It was a really kind of a traumatic experience, but I literally couldn't get anywhere besides my home because there weren't any shelters in my neighborhood that were accessible to me, and there was really nobody to call. And that made me very empathetic, I would say, to people with disabilities during disaster. And we had, in 2005, 2006, I guess, the disasters in New Orleans, hurricanes Katrina and Rita. We operated our ILRU program in Houston, the Southwest ADA Center, and it covers the region that includes Louisiana. And we began to get telephone calls, ADA assistance calls, from the region around New Orleans that had been hit by the storms, from people with disabilities who needed help. They were homeless, just literally overnight homeless. In many cases, the people who were accustomed to helping them were also displaced and couldn't come to help them. It was really a crisis for many people. So we set up a hurricane assistance line for people with disabilities. And over the course of about 3 months, we wound up working 3,000 cases of people with disabilities who were displaced and homeless, largely as a result of the storms. And the stories that they told about trying to get help and the things that happened to them were just heartrending and really captured our attention. And we began to develop systems then to help people systematically. So when people came to Houston to recover from Katrina and Rita, we helped set up shelters in the Houston area. And we learned about making them accessible. And the people who operated the shelters, by and large, were sensitive to the issue of disability, but they had no idea what kinds of provisions need to be made to help people with disabilities. So by the time Hurricane Ike rolled around just a few years ago, we anticipated that there were going to be needs. So we began to work with shelters before the storm even arrived to make sure they understood that it was their obligation to serve people with disabilities just like anybody else. And a number of improvements have been made as a result of these experiences. But even so, just as recently as Hurricane Ike, we had stories along the Gulf Coast of people who were mistreated, really, because they had disabilities. One particular episode caught my attention when a lady called to say that she had been refused admittance to a shelter. And it turns out that she had gone with her family to the shelter, and the shelter manager said, well, your family can come, but you can't. You're in a wheelchair, and we don't have accommodations for you. So they were first going to separate her, and the lady was a good self-advocate. She was distraught. Her family left. They all left together because they wanted to stay together, and as they were getting in their car to get out of the parking lot, they ran into a local deputy who was directing traffic. And he could tell they were upset and said, what's wrong? And she explained they wouldn't let them in the shelter because she had a disability. Well, he called his boss, and the sheriff came out, and at gunpoint, literally, the shelter manager welcomed them into the shelter. But, it's just ridiculous. In that particular case, they had every accommodation the woman needed. They just made the arbitrary decision that they would not serve people with disabilities. Well, the sheriff, good for him. The reality is they violated probably 3-4 laws in the process of that, and we have so much work to do educating providers.
During severe weather conditions or natural disasters, are there laws that apply to those situations in particular?
Well, as far as disasters are concerned, there's the Stafford Act, which was originally created to provide for sheltering in the case of disasters. And the Stafford Act was amended after Hurricane Katrina. In fact, there's a separate Katrina Recovery Act that includes the assurances to people with disabilities that they may be, and also ensures that providers of shelters will serve the needs of people with disabilities in the community. And it applies to a range of activities, including pre-planning, which we'll talk about maybe in a little bit.
Thank you. Now, Leah, what other laws protect people who have disabilities and go to shelters?
Right. So aside from the moral obligation to protect this vulnerable population, there's also a legal obligation. So it is very important that homeless shelters, transitional housing, understand that there could be multiple laws that apply to their situation. The first is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. The ADA applies to any public accommodation. The law actually specifically defines public accommodation to include a social services center establishment, and an example given there is a homeless shelter. So it is very clear that the ADA does apply to homeless shelters, and it does apply regardless of whether that shelter accepts federal funding or not. There's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is similar to the ADA, but only applies to entities that receive federal funding. In some cases, both Section 504 and the ADA could apply if an entity receives federal funding. In addition, there's Chapter 121 of the Texas Human Resources Code. That's the Texas law, the state equivalent, similar provisions as the ADA. The only big distinction there is that the Chapter 121 does not have a religious exemption. So it is really important that even though the ADA does have a religious exemption, state law, Chapter 121 of the Texas Human Resources Code, does not. Of course, there's also Federal and State Fair Housing Act, which oftentimes will apply to housing situations such as homeless shelters, and those have provisions against discrimination of people with disabilities, as well as the Texas Property Code will apply. And the Texas Property Code governs tenancy in housing situations, and so clearly there's going to be provisions there about what a landlord can and can't do in this kind of context.
Now, Leah, a term that we use a lot as advocates is a reasonable accommodation. Can you explain to our audience what that means?
Yeah, so a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification, depending on what law you're dealing with, sometimes they're called modifications or sometimes they're called accommodation. Of course, it is important for the housing provider to really understand which laws they're dealing with. It can be overwhelming because there are multiple laws. So it is important for the housing provider to know most likely one of these laws is going to apply to them, and to really be aware of figuring out which laws they're dealing with. So again, depending on which laws they're dealing with, accommodation, modification. Essentially, accommodation is a change to the policies, practices, or procedures that help to avoid discrimination on the basis of a disability. And we're actually going to be talking about some examples as we go along of different accommodation for people with physical or mental disabilities. In deciding whether or not to grant the accommodation request, it's really important that the housing provider look at the individual. Don't base the decision on stereotypes or on assumptions, but rather look at the individual, look at the case, look at what the person is requesting and what they're needing, because the accommodation can be key and essential to allowing someone to be successful in their housing situation.
And how is reasonable defined?
So reasonable is defined depending on the situation. So obviously the word reasonable, the accommodation has to be reasonable, so the housing provider has to be able to achieve it. But any sort of kind of blanket policy where they say, no, in no cases are we going to allow X, that's probably not going to be reasonable to say we will never allow something. Again, it has to be individually tailored, look at the case, look at the disability, what the person is requesting, and make the decision based on the actual facts that you're presented with, as opposed to any sort of stereotypes or assumptions about the person. In addition, disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Remember that a disability may not always be visible. That's something very important for housing providers to remember. In addition, somebody who has a record of a disability or is regarded as having a disability is also protected under the law.
Great. And how does a person go about asking for reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification?
That's a really good question. We always recommend that it be put in writing, though the law does not require that it be in writing. Putting it in writing can help just for clarity or for confirmation, but the law does not say that it be in writing. So it can be orally or it can be in writing. And it just needs to have the request as of a reasonable accommodation. The person with a disability can make that request, or a person can make that request on their behalf, such as a medical provider, a social services worker. And it doesn't need to require extensive medical information or any private medical information. It's not required that that be included.
Lex, what are some examples of reasonable accommodations and modifications that you've seen put into place for people with physical disabilities at shelters?
Well, I mean, the most obvious ones are those that have to do with physical access. So you think about people needing to get into and out of the shelter. First, they have to have a place to park. If they have a vehicle or they come in a vehicle, they have to have a place where they can be dropped off. You can be assured that sooner or later somebody who uses a wheelchair will want to have entrance to the shelter, so you need to plan for those kinds of accommodations. The doorway must be wide enough. It's hard for me to imagine now any shelters that wouldn't have a wide enough doorway to get in the beginning, but secondarily, the bathroom facilities need to have some reasonable accommodations, and therefore the bathroom doorway must be wide enough and there must be enough space inside the toilet room, the bathroom, for somebody to get there with a wheelchair. Now, in the case of a shelter that's not a permanent facility, there may be no need to completely reconstruct the bathroom. And that's where the concept of reasonable accommodation that Leah mentioned comes in. But those are the kinds of things that people with physical disabilities need most of all. If the shelter is an overnight shelter, then obviously somebody needs to be able to get to a bed or a cot. And sometimes these cots are made so close to the ground. In fact, some shelters, I think, don't even put the mattresses on a cot. It's difficult for somebody in a wheelchair to get into and out of those kinds of beds. So a reasonable accommodation would be to have some beds that were up at a height that a person in a wheelchair could get into and out of. Other people who have sensory impairments, I don't know if it's easier or harder for people to make accommodations for them, but there's no great expense involved in any of these accommodations, Veronica, and I think that's where shelter operators sometimes get confused. They think we're going to have to invest a lot of money to make these shelters accessible. You don't. You have to make a reasonable accommodation. A wooden hand-built ramp on the front of a building can get a wheelchair into it. The accommodations for people with sensory impairments, people who are blind, obviously, can't read printed announcements, so announcements need to be made orally. On the other hand, a person who is deaf obviously can't hear an oral announcement, so announcements need to be presented in writing in some kind of alternate format, we call it. So these considerations are evident, and if there is communication for deaf people, they need to have access to interpreters. But that doesn't mean an interpreter has to be on staff 24/7. They just have to be available on call if necessary to explain the procedures of the shelter or something else. People don't think about recreation. Sometimes there are recreational facilities associated with shelters. These must be accessible to people with sensory and physical impairments as well. And finally, if there's a prayer room or something of that nature, should be accessible. And by the way, we recommend that shelters offer some kind of private areas for people with disabilities. The assumption was first made that these were valuable for people with emotional issues, for cognitive impairments, some mental problems. But that's not necessarily the case. People who live in shelters very long need after a while to have some private space. So it's important to have those kinds of spaces available, and they need to be accessible. The other thing that I would mention is sometimes people get into shelters who have dietary needs. And it's very often the case that the shelter managers don't want residents in their kitchens. But in the case of people who have specific dietary needs, the shelter may be obliged to provide them with refrigeration for special foods that they might have or medicines. And if they have a special means of preparing their food, they may need access to that kitchen to do that. And that would be a reasonable modification.
Now, what about people who use home health care providers?
That's a good point. The providers need to be able to have access to them. A lot of shelters have rules that say, look, you're resident, and this is not like a drop-in facility. It's not home, so you can't have visitors over, and so on. But people who are providing assistance to people with disabilities are not like visitors in the home. They're not like friends casually coming in for a chat. These are people who the person may need to assist them with their care. Those people should be allowed in. They should be allowed to stay overnight if necessary, to accompany them as they occupy their space in the in the facility. Another thing that I should mention there too is that many people with, particularly those with physical impairments, have needs for private space for toileting and for other hygienic activities. They may not be able to do those things sitting in their wheelchair, and they may need to have access to private space while they're in the bed. So the idea of using some kind of portable wall or curtain or something like that works very well.
Many shelters require folks who are staying with them to take part in chores around the shelter. Everyone cooperates, everyone pitches in. Have you seen accommodations that have to be, or that should be made for people with physical disabilities?
Well, I mean, to me, that's pretty obvious. Everybody in the shelter means everybody in the shelter. So if the shelter requires people to do tours, or if it's part of the shelter's service plan, maybe it's not a requirement of the shelter, but maybe the shelter offers that so that people will become accustomed with the facilities and know where places are and things, know what the rules are for those spaces and so on. Those obviously have to accommodate people with disabilities as well. So to the extent that any kind of a service, like a tour, like an evening program, any kind of activity like that needs to be accessible to everyone in the shelter, remembering that everyone may include people with disabilities.
What about the need for space for medical equipment?
Well, some people do have medical equipment they bring with them. We recommend in the case of disasters that people with disabilities always have a go bag packed with their extra medications, prescriptions, an extra pair of glasses. By the way, glasses are the one physical aid that people most often lose in the case of a disaster, and I suppose they may misplace them in shelters as well. So we suggest people have an extra pair of glasses that they carry with them, but some people have need to carry with them oxygen, other kinds of medicines that may be only available to them, and they have to take the medicine with them. These are all kinds of accommodations that need to be made. I mentioned the refrigeration in the case of certain kinds of medicine, but people may need to have a locker near their bed space where they can keep some of their supplies and equipment. A lot of people who have wheelchairs need to park the wheelchair nearby. And that's another thing we haven't mentioned really, is the whole issue of people who have equipment that has electrical needs. So I've seen in shelters before, a generator may be running and there may be some public electricity available. And what's happening there? Everybody's charging their cell phone and their laptop, right? But that person who has a battery-powered wheelchair or a battery-powered breathing device should have priority for that electricity when it's there. And the shelters must ensure that people do have access to that power.
What if there's an emergency at the shelter and you have the need for an evacuation?
Well, you know, getting into the shelter is one thing. Getting out of the shelter in an emergency is another thing. And evacuations sometimes require people to go out exits that may not have been accessible. So there needs to be a plan in place. The plan needs to be in place before the shelter is set up to accommodate people with disabilities in the shelter. And it needs to be in place to evacuate them in case of an emergency. And that, you know, you have to take into consideration people with some kinds of impairments may need direction. People with cognitive impairments get very, very confused often in a disaster, and they may need somebody assigned to them to help them get out. In the case of an emergency, people who are visually impaired obviously need somebody to at least give them orientation so they can find their way out if they don't have assistance. Deaf people will not necessarily hear these announcements, so somebody needs to be assigned to be sure that people who are hearing impaired have access to the information that's being provided in the emergency evacuation announcements. And then obviously a pathway needs to be there so that somebody who's using a mobility appliance of some sort can actually get out without injuring themselves further.
Thank you. These are great examples. Thank you. Leah, can you give us some examples of reasonable accommodations or modifications for people with mental disabilities?
Sure. So again, these are just examples. I think that housing providers, there's an unlimited number of accommodations that may need to be requested. Most of them don't cost the housing provider, the homeless shelter, anything. It's simply just a change into their policy, their procedures, that's just a small tweak that can make the world of difference for a person with disability, and also helps to avoid discrimination, which would be a legal obligation for the homeless shelter. So one example would be just going over the rules and the procedures with an individual with an intellectual disability. So maybe reading it to them instead of just handing them the rules and procedures so that they can have that information. That would be one common example that we see. Another would be if somebody has a mental health diagnosis and that has resulted in some violations of some of the homeless shelter's rules, maybe a noise violation, rather than just simply banning the resident as an accommodation, allowing them to seek treatment first instead of just a blanket ban on that resident. Seek treatment to see if that can alleviate the symptoms of that disability. So that includes noise violation, maybe things with rules around alcohol and drugs, or yelling, aggressive behavior, allowing that person as an accommodation to seek treatment first before a blanket ban. In addition, it's really important that transitional housing remember the housing first model. So an example of how that housing first model might work is that the lights can't be cut off or the tenant locked out for failure to attend mandatory counseling sessions. The housing first model means that mental health services are not a requirement of tenancy. So housing first, and then the transitional or support services. So just because there hasn't been some sort of attendance in the counseling session, something like that, that they can't just say, okay, that's the end, you're going to be kicked out of our housing facility. So that kind of accommodation is another common one that we might see in this context.
What if, for instance, a shelter for programmatic reasons has a set schedule for when people have to get up in the mornings and leave the shelter for the day, and a person has a mental disability that interferes with their ability to sleep well at night, and then therefore getting up at a certain hour is difficult? What could a shelter do in that situation?
So the very simple accommodation that could be done there is to allow that person to sleep in, to have an extended time for them to continue their sleep since their disability interferes with their sleep. That's a very easy accommodation. Again, doesn't cost the shelter any money, and is just a simple change in their policy.
So what both of you have talked about really is examples of when a housing provider, in this case a homeless shelter, has to treat people with disabilities differently. Have you seen any sort of negative reaction from the shelters and saying, well, wait, we're supposed to treat everyone equally and now we're asked to treat them differently? And how do you answer that?
Yeah, so that's what I hear a lot. Well, if we make an exception for this person, we have to make it for everyone. And I think the key there is that this person is requesting it because of their disability. It's to allow them to participate in your services, to live in the shelter, to be in the shelter. It's the only way they can meaningfully participate in the program they're offering. So it isn't the same as saying if we make it for this person, we'll have to make it for everyone. It's because of a disability that that person is requesting the accommodation. And so that's why there's this accommodation requirement under the law as to why they do have to provide that.
Leah, there may be other considerations as well, and that is in the case of somebody who uses a service animal. That animal, for a person who is blind, for example, may be their key to mobility in the space, and it may mean life or death to that person in the case that there was an evacuation or something of that nature. These animals must be accommodated. And that may also mean that the shelter manager is required to allow them to be fed in the facility by the individuals who's caring for them and responsible for them, and there may need to be storage space for that food for that animal and so on. These are the kinds of things that kind of catch shelter managers off guard sometime, because they certainly don't want to have, not any that I'm aware of, like to have pets that they're housing in addition to people. As important as that may be, it's not a requirement, but under the law, it is true that shelters must accommodate people who have need for service animals. But there's also now a new wrinkle, and that is people who have emotional support animals. Can you elaborate a little bit, Leah, on the difference between the emotional support animals and those that are strictly speaking, service animals?
Sure. So I know Veronica can mention something about it as well, but the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, has a specific definition of service animal, but there's also the Fair Housing Act, which when we're dealing with shelters frequently applies, and that also allows for service animals as well as emotional support animals. Is that right, Veronica?
Yes, yes, it is. And, you know, just in both my advocacy and just my day-to-day life, I've noticed that, perhaps you have as well, that more and more people who are homeless have animals with them. And I was reading this article about a man who, it was in a city that was experiencing freezing conditions. And the man refused to leave the streets because he had an animal, he had a dog. And so luckily for him, the shelter picked up on this and they said, we'll find a foster care program for the animal while you're in the shelter. And the man actually was going through employment programs at the shelter and had access to his dog regularly. So as an advocate, my first thought was, what if he had a disability and he was actually legally entitled to have the animal with him while he was staying at the shelter? And as Leah pointed out, the laws are going to vary both by the housing provider, so whether the ADA or the Fair Housing Act or both of them apply to the provider, but also the type of animal. So the service animal is defined by both laws as doing a very specific job or task for a person with a disability. That's your test. You have a disability and the animal does something specifically for you. So some examples are, as Lex pointed to, dogs that are guides for people with vision problems or who are blind. It could also be an animal that alerts its owner as to an epilepsy episode it's about to come on, or a diabetic episode. It could be a dog that protects or shields someone with PTSD by moving a crowd away from its owner. It could even, under the ADA, be a miniature horse that guides a person who is blind or needs some guidance. The ADA says that a service animal can only be a dog or a miniature horse in certain situations. The Fair Housing Act says that the service animal can be of any type. Emotional support animals, as you pointed out too, Lex, are different in that they help people with emotional and mental disabilities. And so they're, by their very nature, without any training, aren't doing a job. They're just providing the alleviation or an improvement in the person's condition. So for instance, it could be that a person with really severe depression adopts a dog. And the dog provides a routine for the person. They have to get up in the mornings to feed the dog, to take the dog outside. They have to take the dog out for walks. And there's a routine now that may not have existed for that person. It may have been almost nearly impossible for that person to get up in the mornings. But now there's a motivation. Often, it would be easier for my clients to have a prescription medication that would make their life better. There's no need to accommodate, there's no need to worry about food or grooming, veterinary visits. But what an animal brings also can sometimes not be fulfilled by a medication. The animal provides this routine. It also provides love and affection. And for people with mental disabilities, sometimes their world is so small that the animal really is their life. It is their only communication sometimes with the outside world. So other examples could be, and what I look at with my clients is the before and the after. How has your life improved since you obtained the animal? It could be someone who had crying spells and they adopted a cat, and since they've had the cat, they've noticed a decrease in the frequency or duration of the crying spells. Even, for example, with the potbelly pig, someone with anxiety who adopts the animal, and because of the animal and having to take care of something else besides themselves, they've developed confidence, which then in turn has helped them complete tasks in other areas of their lives. The American Disabilities Act, which applies to all shelters, does not protect people's rights to emotional support animals. The Fair Housing Act does. So again, as Leah pointed out, it's really important for a housing provider, a shelter, to understand what laws apply and what obligations they have.
Veronica, there are tests that shelter managers can use to determine whether the animal fits from a legal standpoint under the category of emotional support animal, are there not?
Well, the test is really, in terms of what questions can be asked of the person, for instance, because health information is so protected by the laws, and people are entitled to their privacy, even if they have a disability, they're not obligated to tell you what it is. The housing provider can ask, what does this animal do for you? That's one of the questions that
And that applies strictly to animals that are support animals. But for if a person really has a disability, has a need for an emotional support animal, their best option is to have a letter from their doctor that describes their need for that animal. And that, in many cases, will eliminate a lot of issues. By the same token, the shelter manager can't say to the person, you must have this in order for me to accommodate you. The accommodation needs to be made if the person has that need and asserts that claim, right?
Absolutely.
And I do think, though, it's important to explain that in the context of the ADA, there is not a requirement of a letter from a medical provider. I think, as you were explaining, in the context of the ADA, the only two questions that can be asked are, is this animal required or this dog required because of a disability? And two, what tasks or services has this dog been trained to do to assist you with your disability? And so that's when we're thinking of the ADA. Again, there's so many laws that could apply. It really is important that shelters understand their obligation under the law and understand which laws may apply to them. So in the ADA context, though, there isn't a requirement of medical documentation or a formal request.
That is correct. And of course, as lawyers, we prefer documentation. So we prefer that you do have a letter from, it doesn't have to be a doctor, it could be the therapist, it could be someone who is familiar with your health issues and is in some sort of medical profession.
From the standpoint of the shelter provider, the important thing is to plan for these things ahead of time.
Absolutely.
Understand what your rights are as a provider in terms of asking these questions. You don't want to ask the wrong question and learn about that in court. You want to ask the question before you're confronted with the situation. Get good advice. Get good advice from your attorney. Get good advice from the association you may belong to, and you can solve these problems, and they won't be problems, because I think most shelter managers in their hearts are doing what they do because they want to help people, and discrimination certainly doesn't achieve those ends.
That's exactly right.
Absolutely.
Veronica, what if the animal has signs of aggression or behavior problems?
Well, there's sometimes people, because of what they see on TV, have developed stereotypes, or they don't like certain types of dogs, for instance. Dogs are going to be the most commonly used support animal, and they'll want to deny based on the breed of the animal or the size or the weight, and neither the ADA nor the FHA allow that. They don't want you to discriminate against people. They don't want you to discriminate against the type of animal based on stereotypes or myths that you may believe about that breed. And so however, that's not a blanket, pass for the owner. The owner is still responsible for the animal. And so if there are signs of aggression, the housing provider has to really look at whether this particular animal is a direct threat. You have to look at recent evidence of acts by the animal of aggression. You have to look at whether an additional modification, so you have an accommodation for the animal itself, but now an additional accommodation for minimizing the animal's risk to other people. And it could also, they also need to look at what the owner is doing or hasn't in the past to alleviate any kind of risk. Are they using a muzzle? Are they using medication? Are they doing more training on the animal? Now, that said, the animal is still the owner's responsibility. They're responsible for finding food, for finding medication, for complying with local laws regarding registration, vaccinations, microchipping, etc. And so the support animals do provide an added level of service that the housing providers have to provide, but it's not impossible, it's not insurmountable, and there are a number of shelters in Texas as well as in other parts of the country that are providing these kinds of services in a very successful way, that are working for folks who don't have disabilities by providing foster care for those animals, but then for folks who do have a disability, they recognize they have a legal obligation and are looking for resources to be able to comply with the law. Now, we have provided a lot of information today for shelters. Lex and Leah, do you have any final words of encouragement and recommendations for shelters?
Well, I mean, the recommendation that I would make is plan ahead. Don't wait until an issue confronts you to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. And so along those same lines, have a directory of people that you can contact for help, for questions. Know which laws apply to your situation, to your organization, to your shelter. And as well as, the worst thing that you can do is let fear or stereotypes make your decision to turn someone away. Again, shelters are there to serve the public, and as Lex said earlier, we know that shelter managers have in their heart to do the best interest of their clients. So we're hopeful that this presentation has been helpful in helping service managers and shelter managers make decisions going forward.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope that this program has been informative and it has encouraged you to seek additional resources for serving people with disabilities at homeless shelters and transitional living centers.